Story 1. The Loop at Mile Marker 43. Robert Hayes had been driving long-haul routes for 22 years when he encountered the stretch of Interstate 80 that broke his understanding of reality. It was November of 2023, and he was hauling refrigerated pharmaceuticals from Salt Lake City to Omaha, a route he'd driven dozens of times without incident. The load was worth close to $2 million, which meant no delays, no excuses, and absolutely no room for error. He left Salt Lake just after sunset, the massive Peterbilt humming beneath him as he merged onto I-80 heading east. The weather forecast called for clear skies across Wyoming, perfect conditions for making good time. His GPS showed an estimated arrival of 6:15 the following evening, accounting for mandatory rest stops and fuel. Robert had the route memorized, every exit, every truck stop, every steep grade where he'd need to downshift. He'd been driving this particular corridor since 2001, back when his daughter was still in elementary school. Now she was married with kids of her own, and Robert was still out here chasing white lines across the heartland. The first few hours passed without incident. He listened to a podcast about cold cases, sipped lukewarm coffee from a thermos, and watched the landscape flatten as he left the mountains behind. Around 11 p.m. he crossed into Wyoming. The highway stretched before him like a black ribbon, illuminated only by his headlights and the occasional reflective mile marker. Traffic was sparse, a few scattered taillights in the distance, nothing unusual for a Tuesday night in November. Mile marker 43 appeared in his headlights at 11:47 p.m. Robert noted it only because his bladder was telling him he'd need a rest stop soon, and he was trying to calculate whether he could make it to the travel plaza at Rawlins, still about 30 miles ahead. The marker itself was unremarkable, just standard green metal with white reflective numbers. He passed it doing 68 miles per hour. The legal limit for commercial vehicles on this stretch. That's when his GPS did something strange. The screen flickered, the blue route line disappeared for a moment, then reappeared. The estimated arrival time jumped forward by 30 minutes, then back again. Robert frowned and tapped the screen, thinking it was a glitch. The device had been acting temperamental lately, occasionally losing satellite connection in remote areas. He made a mental note to replace it when he got back home. 5 minutes later, he passed mile marker 43 again. At first, Robert thought he'd misread it. Maybe it was 42 or 44 and his tired eyes had played tricks on him. But no, there it was, clearly illuminated in his headlights. Mile marker 43. The same dented post, the same slight lean to the left. He definitely passed this exact marker 5 minutes ago. His stomach tightened. He checked his speedometer. 68 miles per hour, exactly as before. At that speed, he should have covered more than 5 miles. He should be approaching mile marker 48 by now. Instead, here was 43 again, impossible as that seemed. Robert grabbed his CB radio handset. Breaker 19, this is Highway Phantom eastbound on I-80 near mile marker 43. Any drivers in the area you got your ears on? Static hissed back at him. I repeat, Highway Phantom looking for any eastbound traffic on I-80 in Wyoming. Anybody out there? More static, nothing else. The CB was working. He could hear the carrier wave, but no one was responding. He checked his phone. No signal, which wasn't unusual in rural Wyoming, but the timing felt wrong. He'd had 2 bars just 15 minutes ago. Now the screen showed nothing, not even a searching signal indicator. Just a blank spot where the service bars should be. The highway ahead looked exactly as it had before. Same gentle curve to the right, same spacing of the shoulder reflectors, same distant darkness pressing in from all sides. Robert's hands tightened on the steering wheel. 22 years on the road had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. He kept driving. What else could he do? Pull over and wait? Wait for what? He maintained his speed, watching the odometer tick forward. 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, 4 miles, 5 miles. Mile marker 43 appeared in his headlights again. Jesus Christ, Robert whispered. His heart was hammering now, adrenaline flooding his system. This wasn't possible. It violated every law of physics, every rule of reality he'd ever known. He was moving forward. The odometer confirmed it. The engine confirmed it. The sensation of motion confirmed it. But somehow he was ending up back at the same place. He tried the CB again. Nothing. He tried his phone again. No signal. He checked his GPS, which now showed him as a blue dot on a completely blank screen. No roads, no landmarks. Nothing but that solitary dot and a spinning wheel indicating it was searching for data. The clock on his dashboard read 12:03 a.m. He'd been driving for 16 minutes since first passing mile marker 43, covering approximately 18 miles according to his odometer. And yet here he was, back at mile marker 43 for the third time. Robert made a decision. The next time he reached this point, he would mark it somehow, leave evidence that he'd been here before. He grabbed the half-empty coffee thermos from the cup holder and waited. 5 minutes later, mile marker 43 appeared again. As he passed it, Robert hurled the thermos out the window. He watched in his mirrors as it tumbled across the shoulder and came to rest against the marker post. He drove forward, counting the seconds, watching the mile markers tick by, 44, 45, 46. Relief flooded through him. Maybe it had stopped, whatever it was. Maybe he'd broken free of whatever temporal anomaly had caught him. Then 47 appeared, then 48, and Robert started to breathe easier. Mile marker 43 materialized in his headlights with the coffee thermos still resting against its base, exactly where he'd thrown it. This time Robert felt genuine fear, cold and sharp in his chest. He wasn't going anywhere. He was trapped in some kind of loop, some impossible circle that kept returning him to the same 5-mile stretch of highway no matter how far he drove. The thought of it continuing forever, driving the same 5 miles for eternity, made him nauseous. He tried varying his speed. He floored the accelerator, pushing the Peterbilt up to 80 miles per hour. Mile marker 43 appeared right on schedule. He slowed to 40 miles per hour. Same result. He tried pulling onto the shoulder and stopping completely for 5 minutes. When he resumed driving, mile marker 43 waited ahead. The clock showed 12:37 a.m. now. He'd been trapped for 50 minutes, completing the loop at least 10 times. His fuel gauge had dropped noticeably. The engine was burning diesel normally, consuming resources that were very much finite. If this continued, he would eventually run out of fuel. And then what? Would he be stuck here forever, stranded at mile marker 43 in a truck that couldn't move? Robert's hands were shaking. He'd seen a lot in 22 years. Accidents, storms, mechanical failures, difficult customers. But nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing in his experience, nothing in the training manuals, nothing in the countless stories swapped with other drivers at truck stops addressed what to do when the highway itself stopped making sense. He tried driving with his eyes closed, counting to 60, thinking maybe if he didn't see the mile markers, they wouldn't reset. When he opened his eyes, there was 43 again. He tried driving in reverse, backing down the highway for half a mile before turning around. It made no difference. He tried pulling off onto the shoulder between markers, thinking maybe he could avoid triggering whatever mechanism was causing this. But there was no exit, no side road, nowhere to go except forward and backward along the same cursed 5-mile stretch. Around 1 a.m., something changed. Robert noticed movement in his passenger side mirror. Another truck, a dark-colored semi, was coming up behind him. Hope surged in his chest. Another driver, someone else caught in this same nightmare, or maybe someone from outside who could help. He slowed down, letting the other truck catch up. As it approached, Robert could see it was an older model, maybe from the 1990s, with a sleeper cab and no company markings. The windows were dark, tinted so heavily he couldn't see inside. The truck pulled alongside him and matched his speed, staying parallel. Robert waved, tried to signal, but there was no response. The other truck just cruised alongside, keeping perfect pace. He couldn't see the driver, couldn't see any movement in the cab. The truck looked almost abandoned, running on autopilot. After a minute of this eerie parallel driving, the other truck suddenly accelerated, pulling ahead. Robert watched it disappear into the darkness ahead. When mile marker 43 appeared again, the other truck was there, parked sideways across both lanes, blocking the road. Robert slammed on his brakes, the Peterbilt's air brakes screaming as the massive vehicle shuddered and slowed. He stopped with maybe 20 feet to spare, his headlights illuminating the other truck. It sat there silent and dark, no running lights, no indication of a driver. Just a solid wall of metal blocking his path. He sat there for a full minute, waiting, watching. The other truck didn't move. Robert's radio suddenly crackled to life, making him jump. A voice came through, distorted and strange, layered with static. "You're not supposed to be here." Robert grabbed the handset. "Who is this? Where am I? What's happening?" The voice didn't respond to his questions. Instead, it repeated the same phrase. "You're not supposed to be here." Then the radio went dead again, returning to the hissing static. Robert made a decision. He put the Peterbilt in reverse and backed up. Maybe he could find an earlier mile marker, work his way backward out of the loop. He reversed for what felt like 10 minutes, checking his mirrors constantly, backing down the highway at 20 miles per hour. When he finally stopped and turned around, mile marker 43 was directly in front of him. The other truck was gone. He was alone again on the empty highway, as if the other truck had never existed. But Robert knew what he'd seen. He knew what he'd heard on the radio. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't natural, wasn't explicable by any rational means. He was caught in something that existed outside the normal rules of space and time. The clock showed 1:43 a.m., nearly 2 hours trapped. Robert's mouth was dry, his hands cramping from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. He thought about his daughter, his grandkids. He'd promised to visit for Thanksgiving next week. Would he be here forever, driving this same stretch of highway while his family wondered what happened to him? He tried prayer, though he wasn't a religious man. He tried bargaining with whatever force had trapped him here, promising to quit driving, to change his life, anything to get free. The highway gave no response. Mile marker 43 kept appearing like clockwork, mocking him with its familiar green surface and white numbers. Around 2:30 a.m., Robert noticed something different. The loop was still happening, but now there were subtle variations. Small details that weren't quite right. The dent in the mile marker post was on the wrong side. The reflector spacing looked slightly off. The curve ahead seemed sharper than before. It was as if he was cycling through slightly different versions of the same stretch of highway, each one almost identical but not quite. At 3 a.m., with his fuel gauge now below half and exhaustion making his vision blur, Robert saw headlights ahead. Not behind him this time, but coming toward him from the other direction. An eastbound vehicle in the westbound lanes, heading straight at him. Robert flashed his high beams, trying to warn the other driver, but the vehicle kept coming. As it got closer, he realized it was his own truck, his own Peterbilt, complete with the distinctive dent in the front bumper he'd gotten in Cheyenne last year. The truck passed him like a mirror image, and Robert caught a glimpse of the driver. Himself, looking just as terrified and confused as he felt now. The other Robert's mouth was moving, shouting something Robert couldn't hear. Then the truck was past, disappearing into the darkness behind him. That's when Robert understood. He wasn't just caught in a loop through space. He was caught in a loop through time as well, cycling through the same 5 miles, the same hour, over and over. Every version of himself was trapped here, driving the same stretch, passing the same mile marker, experiencing the same confusion and fear. An infinite number of Robert Hayes, all stuck in this impossible moment. The realization should have broken him, but instead it crystallized his thinking. If he was looping through time, then maybe the loop had a beginning. Maybe there was a moment when it started, a trigger point. And if there was a trigger point, maybe there was a way to avoid it, to break the cycle. He thought back to his first pass of mile marker 43 before the loop began. What had been different? The GPS had glitched. The screen had flickered. What if that was the moment? What if some kind of electromagnetic anomaly had caught him, and the GPS had detected it first? The next time mile marker 43 approached, Robert turned off everything electronic in the cab. GPS, radio, phone, even the digital dashboard displays. He drove with only the mechanical gauges working, using the steering wheel and throttle by pure feel. He passed mile marker 43 in complete electronic silence. Mile marker 44 appeared ahead, then 45, 46, 47, 48, 49. Mile marker 50 glowed in his headlights, and Robert let out a sob of relief. He was free. The loop was broken. He'd escaped. He didn't turn any electronics back on, didn't trust them, just kept driving by the mechanical instruments alone. When he finally saw the lights of Rawlins in the distance, it was nearly 4:30 a.m. He'd lost over 4 hours to the loop, but he was out. Robert pulled into the first truck stop and shut down. He sat in the cab shaking for 20 minutes before he could even move. When he finally checked his phone, it showed dozens of missed calls from dispatch, messages asking where he was, why he wasn't responding. His GPS showed his location correctly now, but there was a gap in the tracking data. 4 hours and 17 minutes where he simply hadn't existed according to the satellite record. He called dispatch, told them he'd had equipment failures, needed to rest. He didn't mention the loop, didn't try to explain. Who would believe him? He wasn't even sure he believed it himself, except for the lost time, the burned fuel, the complete absence of any electronic record of where he'd been. Robert completed the delivery to Omaha right on schedule despite the delay, pushing hard to make up time. But he never drove that stretch of I-80 in Wyoming again. He took routes that added hours to his trips, burned extra fuel, cost him money. Other drivers asked why, and he just said he preferred the scenery elsewhere. 6 months later, he heard a story from another trucker at a fuel stop in Kansas. A driver named Patricia Sullivan had disappeared on I-80 in Wyoming, somewhere near Rawlins. Her truck was eventually found abandoned at mile marker 43, engine still running, fuel tank empty, no sign of Patricia. The logbook showed she'd been driving for over 14 hours straight, though the electronic logs had a 4-hour gap with no data. Robert never told anyone what he knew. He just quietly requested routes that kept him away from Wyoming, away from that stretch of impossible highway. He retired from long-haul driving in 2024, exactly 1 year after the loop. His daughter asked him why he quit, and he told her he was ready for something new. But sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, Robert would check traffic cameras online, scanning the feeds from I-80 in Wyoming. And occasionally, just for a second or two, he would see a truck passing mile marker 43 over and over in the same frame, like a video glitch or compression error. The same truck, the same mile marker, the same impossible loop. He always closed the browser quickly after that, trying not to think about who might be driving that truck, or how long they'd been trapped there, or whether they would ever get out. Some highways, Robert learned, were best left untraveled. Some stretches of road existed in places where the normal rules didn't apply, where time and space folded in on themselves, where drivers could disappear into loops that had no end. Mile marker 43 was one of those places, and Robert Hayes was one of the lucky ones who made it back. Story 2. The Shifting Interchange. Marcus Donovan had been hauling freight across the Midwest for 17 years when the interchange at Highway 94 stopped existing in any consistent way. He first encountered the anomaly in March of 2022 during what should have been a routine run from Minneapolis to Chicago. The load was auto parts, nothing special, scheduled for delivery to a manufacturing plant outside of Gary, Indiana. Marcus had made this exact run at least 200 times over his career. He knew every exit, every rest area, every good place to stop for fuel. The interchange he needed was where Interstate 90 crossed Highway 94, a major junction about 40 miles south of Minneapolis. It was marked clearly on every map. A well-traveled intersection with proper signage, lighting, and multiple approach lanes. Marcus had used it countless times without incident. It was as familiar to him as his own driveway. But on this particular night, approaching the interchange around 10 p.m., Marcus noticed the signs were wrong. The first indicator showed Highway 94 east-west in the standard green and white, but the exit number was different. Instead of exit 62, which had been there for decades, the sign read exit 98. Marcus frowned. Maybe they'd renumbered the exits, some kind of transportation department reorganization project he hadn't heard about. It was the only explanation that made sense. He took the exit, following the ramp that should have led to Highway 94 westbound. But instead of merging onto a familiar 4-lane highway, Marcus found himself on a narrow 2-lane road with no streetlights. The pavement was rough, cracked, overgrown with weeds on both shoulders. It looked like a road that hadn't been maintained in years, maybe decades. His GPS showed him on Highway 94, the blue line of his route running straight across the screen. But what he was seeing through his windshield didn't match. This wasn't Highway 94. This was some abandoned rural route that looked like it belonged in the 1950s. Marcus slowed down, looking for a place to turn around. The road was too narrow for a proper U-turn with his 53-foot trailer, so he'd need to find a parking lot or wide shoulder. He drove slowly, high beams cutting through the darkness, revealing more cracked pavement and overgrown vegetation. No other vehicles, no lights from houses or businesses, nothing but empty road stretching ahead. After about 3 miles, the road simply ended. Not at an intersection or a turnaround, but just ended. The pavement stopped at a wall of dense forest, trees growing so close together they formed an impenetrable barrier. There were no signs, no indication of what had happened or where the road was supposed to go. Just pavement, then trees, as if the road had been abandoned mid-construction. Marcus stopped the truck, put it in park, and sat there trying to process what he was seeing. This was impossible. Roads didn't just end like this, not major highway interchanges, and certainly not Highway 94, which was a crucial transportation corridor across the southern part of Minnesota. He pulled out his phone and opened the mapping app. It showed him on Highway 94, 3 miles west of Interstate 90. The road ahead appeared clear and normal on the digital map, running west for hundreds of miles. But through his windshield, there was only forest. Marcus put the truck in reverse and backed down the road for a 1/4 mile until he found a spot wide enough to execute a 3-point turn. It took several minutes and a lot of careful maneuvering, but eventually he got the truck turned around and headed back the way he'd come. The return trip should have brought him back to the interchange in 3 miles. Instead, Marcus drove for nearly 20 minutes, covering at least 15 miles of road before he saw lights ahead. When he finally reached what should have been the on-ramp to Interstate 90, he found himself at a completely different interchange. The signs indicated Highway 52 and County Road 12, intersections that were nowhere near where he should be, at least 40 miles from his original location. Marcus pulled into a truck stop and checked his map. He'd somehow traveled from the Interstate 90 interchange to a completely different part of Minnesota, covering a distance of over 30 miles on a 3-mile stretch of road. It made no sense. He'd been driving in a straight line following what the GPS claimed was Highway 94, but he'd ended up somewhere else entirely. He asked the clerk inside if there had been any road construction or closures on Highway 94. The clerk, a young woman in her 20s, looked at him strangely. Highway 94? There's no Highway 94 around here. You might be thinking of Highway 52. Marcus pulled up the map on his phone and showed her. Right here. Highway 94 runs east-west through southern Minnesota. The clerk studied the map, zooming in and out, then shook her head. That's weird. My phone shows Highway 52 in that spot, not 94. They compared phones. On Marcus's device, Highway 94 was clearly marked. On the clerk's phone, the same location showed Highway 52. Two different maps, two different realities looking at the same piece of ground. Marcus bought a paper map from the truck stop, one of the old-fashioned folding ones that covered the whole state. The paper map showed Highway 94 right where it should be. Relief flooded through him. It wasn't just his phone, wasn't just some digital glitch. The highway existed on the official state map. He drove back toward Interstate 90 using the paper map as a guide, determined to find the interchange and figure out what had happened. The route took him through several small towns he didn't recognize, past landmarks that weren't on his GPS. After nearly an hour of driving, he approached what should have been the interchange from a different direction. The signs looked right this time. Interstate 90, Highway 94 east-west, exit 62. Marcus took the exit, following the ramp carefully. It led him onto a 4-lane highway that looked modern and well-maintained, exactly what Highway 94 should look like. Traffic was light but present, other vehicles moving normally. Marcus started to relax. Whatever had happened before, it seemed to be over now. He was back on the right road. He drove west for about 10 miles, watching the mile markers tick by. 115, 116, 117. Everything normal. Then, without warning, the highway narrowed. 4 lanes became 2. The pavement quality deteriorated and the streetlights disappeared. Within the space of a quarter mile, Marcus was back on the same abandoned road he'd encountered earlier. This time, he didn't drive to the end. He stopped immediately and checked his GPS. It still showed him on Highway 94, the route line running straight ahead. The mile marker nearest to him, visible in his headlights, read 118. But according to his GPS, marker 118 should be on a modern 4-lane highway, not this deteriorated 2-lane road. Marcus grabbed his CB radio. Breaker 19, this is Iron Horse looking for any drivers on Highway 94 in Minnesota. Anybody out there? Static answered him, but then a voice broke through. Iron Horse, this is Desert Rat. I'm on 94 westbound, about 10 miles east of Fairmont. Where are you? Marcus paused, trying to figure out how to explain. I'm on 94 west of Interstate 90, at least I think I am. What does the road look like where you are? 4 lanes, good pavement, light traffic, standard highway. Why? Marcus felt his stomach sink. That's not what I'm seeing. I'm on a 2-lane road, looks abandoned. Are you sure you're on 94? There was a pause, then Desert Rat came back. Checking my GPS now. Yeah, I'm definitely on 94. Been on it for 20 miles, no problems. You feeling okay, driver? Marcus didn't know how to answer that. Yeah, I'm good, just confused. Safe travels. He put down the handset and sat in the darkened cab, trying to think. Another driver was on Highway 94 at the same time, seeing a completely normal highway while Marcus was looking at something else entirely. 2 drivers, 2 versions of the same road existing simultaneously. He decided to try moving forward again, slowly this time, watching carefully for any changes. The road remained narrow and deteriorated for about 5 miles, then suddenly widened back to 4 lanes. The transition was abrupt, happening at a specific point Marcus marked in his memory. Just past a weathered barn on the south side of the road. Behind that landmark, the road was abandoned. In front of it, the road was modern. Marcus drove back and forth across that transition point several times, watching it happen again and again. Driving west, the road deteriorated just past the barn. Driving east, it improved at the exact same spot. It was like crossing a threshold between two different realities, two different versions of the same highway existing in the same physical space. By midnight, Marcus had driven across the anomaly at least a dozen times, trying to understand it. Each crossing was slightly different. Sometimes the modern highway extended for 10 miles before becoming the abandoned road. Sometimes only 5 miles. Once it lasted for nearly 30 miles before degrading. The length of each version seemed to vary randomly, but the transition point near the barn remained constant. Around 1 a.m., Marcus encountered something new. Driving west on the modern section of highway, he came upon a rest area. The sign indicated it was the Prairie View Rest Stop, a place Marcus knew well from his many trips across this route. He'd stopped there dozens of times over the years. The parking lot had room for maybe 15 trucks. There were clean bathrooms, vending machines, and picnic tables. Marcus pulled in, intending to take a break and clear his head. But as soon as he turned into the parking lot, everything changed. The modern rest stop disappeared, replaced by something older. The building was still there, but it looked different. A 1960s-era structure with faded paint and boarded-up windows. The parking lot was gravel instead of asphalt, and there were no other vehicles. The whole place had an abandoned, forgotten quality. Marcus got out of his truck, leaving the engine running, and approached the building. A metal plaque next to the door read, Prairie View Rest Area, established 1967, closed 1989. The date made his skin crawl. According to this sign, the rest stop had been closed for over 30 years. But Marcus had stopped here less than a month ago. He had clear memories of using the bathroom, buying a Coke from the vending machine, sitting at a picnic table while he ate a sandwich. He walked around the building, finding more evidence of abandonment. The windows were broken, the roof was deteriorating, and vegetation had overtaken the picnic area. This wasn't a rest stop that had been closed recently. This was a rest stop that had been abandoned for decades. Marcus returned to his truck and pulled back onto the highway. Within a mile, he passed another sign for Prairie View Rest Stop, indicating it was 2 miles ahead. When he reached it, the rest stop was modern and operational again, with several trucks parked and lights glowing from the building. Marcus pulled in again, this time finding everything exactly as he remembered. Clean bathrooms, working vending machines, other drivers taking breaks. He approached another driver, an older man in his 60s with a gray beard. "Excuse me, have you noticed anything strange about Highway 94 tonight? Any weird road conditions or anything unusual?" The driver gave him an odd look. "Can't say that I have. Why? You seeing something?" Marcus hesitated. "The road keeps changing. 1 minute it's modern, 4 lanes, well-maintained. The next minute it's narrow and looks like it hasn't been used in years. And the rest stops. They change too." The older driver studied him for a moment. "How long you been driving today?" "About 6 hours, but that's not. Might want to get some rest, friend. Highway hypnosis can make you see things that aren't there. Happened to me once on I-40 through Texas. Thought I saw a whole town that didn't exist." Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to insist that what he was experiencing was real, but he could see the concern in the other driver's eyes. The man thought Marcus was hallucinating from exhaustion. Maybe he was right. Maybe all of this was just fatigue, stress, his mind playing tricks after too many hours behind the wheel. He thanked the driver and returned to his truck. He'd get some sleep, a few hours of rest, and in the morning everything would make sense again. The highway would be normal, consistent, and he could complete his delivery to Chicago without any more strangeness. Marcus climbed into the sleeper cab and set his alarm for 5 a.m. He fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the stress and confusion of the past few hours. He woke to the alarm as scheduled, feeling better. Morning light was filtering through the curtains of the sleeper cab. Marcus got up, used the rest stop bathroom, bought coffee and a breakfast sandwich from the convenience area. Everything looked normal. Other drivers were moving around, starting their trucks, preparing to hit the road. The rest stop was exactly as it should be. Marcus pulled back onto Highway 94, heading west toward Chicago. The highway was perfect. 4 lanes, smooth pavement, clear signage. Traffic was moderate, other vehicles moving at normal speeds. He'd been imagining things last night, Marcus decided. Just exhaustion and highway hypnosis like the older driver had suggested. The mind could play strange tricks under stress. But after about 20 miles, the highway narrowed again. This time, Marcus paid careful attention to the transition. There was no specific landmark, no obvious trigger point. The road just gradually degraded over the course of maybe a mile, becoming narrower, rougher, more abandoned looking. Within 5 miles, Marcus was back on the deteriorated 2-lane road that ended in forest. This time, when he reached the end of the pavement, Marcus got out of his truck with his phone, taking pictures and video. He documented everything: the abrupt end of the road, the wall of trees, the mile marker, which read 138, the condition of the pavement. If this was real, he wanted evidence. If it was hallucination, maybe the photos would look different later, would show him something else. Marcus got back in his truck and turned around again. He drove back east, watching the mile markers count down: 137, 136, 135. The road remained narrow and abandoned. Then at mile marker 123, it widened back to 4 lanes and became modern again. The transition happened over the span of maybe 50 yards, a visible shift from one reality to another. Marcus stopped at the transition point and got out again. He could see both versions of the highway at the same time: the modern 4-lane road behind him and the narrow abandoned road ahead. He walked forward slowly, watching the road change beneath his feet. It was gradual but undeniable, like walking through a fog bank where visibility dropped from miles to yards. He took more pictures, dozens of them, trying to capture the transition. Then he crossed back and forth several times, each time watching the highway change. Modern to abandoned, abandoned to modern, over and over. The boundary seemed to be consistent, at least for now, marked by mile marker 123. Marcus checked the photos on his phone. Every single one showed the same thing: a normal, modern 4-lane highway. There was no abandoned road, no transition point, no evidence of what he was seeing with his own eyes. The camera was showing him one reality while his eyes showed him another. He deleted the photos, hands shaking. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't highway hypnosis. This was something real. Something his eyes could see but cameras couldn't capture. Highway 94 was existing in multiple states simultaneously, and Marcus could perceive all of them. Over the next 3 hours, Marcus systematically mapped the anomaly. He drove back and forth, marking every transition point, measuring every section. He discovered that Highway 94 existed in at least 4 different versions. The modern highway he'd always known, the abandoned 2-lane road from the 1950s, a dirt path that looked even older, and occasionally a complete absence of any road at all. Just open prairie with no indication that pavement had ever been laid. The versions overlapped and intersected in ways that defied spatial logic. Marcus could drive west on the modern highway, transition to the abandoned road, then suddenly find himself on the dirt path without changing direction or speed. The mile markers became meaningless, sometimes counting up when they should count down, sometimes jumping forward by 30 or 40 numbers, sometimes repeating the same number for miles. Around noon, Marcus encountered a vehicle coming toward him from the west, heading east on the highway. It was an old pickup truck, maybe from the 1940s, in pristine condition. The driver was a middle-aged man wearing clothes that looked like they were from the same era. Marcus slowed down and waved, trying to get the other driver's attention. The pickup passed him without acknowledgement, as if Marcus and his massive 18-wheeler weren't there. Marcus watched in his mirrors as the truck continued east, then simply disappeared, fading from view like morning mist. That's when Marcus understood. He wasn't just seeing different versions of the highway. He was seeing different times, different eras, all existing simultaneously on the same stretch of road. The modern Highway 94 from 2022, the abandoned road from the 1980s, the rural route from the 1950s, and even earlier versions, all layered on top of each other. And somehow, Marcus could perceive all of them, could move between them while remaining visible only in his own time. He tried to leave the area, to get completely off Highway 94 and find an alternate route. But every attempt failed. Exit ramps led back to the highway. Alternate roads looped around and merged with Highway 94. It was as if the highway had its own gravity, pulling him back no matter which direction he tried to escape. By late afternoon, Marcus had burned through most of his fuel, driving in circles, trying to find a way out. His delivery deadline had passed. His dispatcher had been calling repeatedly, but Marcus had stopped answering. How could he explain this? How could he tell them he was trapped on a highway that existed in multiple timelines simultaneously? As the sun began to set, Marcus made a decision. He would pick a version of the highway and commit to it, follow it as far as it would take him, and hope it led somewhere real. He chose the modern version, the one that matched his memory and maps. When transitions occurred, when the road tried to shift to an older version, Marcus would turn around and backtrack until he found the modern highway again. It was slow, frustrating work. Sometimes he'd make progress for 10 or 15 miles before the road degraded and he'd have to reverse course. But gradually, over the course of several hours, Marcus moved west, inch by inch, maintaining his position on the contemporary version of Highway 94. By midnight, exhausted and running on fumes, Marcus saw a sign that filled him with relief. Welcome to Iowa. He'd made it across the border, and somehow crossing into Iowa had broken the anomaly's hold. The highway ahead was consistently modern, 4 lanes well lit with normal traffic. Marcus drove for another hour, putting distance between himself and whatever that phenomenon had been, before stopping at a truck stop in Des Moines. He slept for 12 hours straight. When he woke, his phone showed dozens of missed calls and messages from dispatch, from his wife, from other drivers. He'd been out of contact for over 24 hours. Marcus called dispatch first, told them he'd had mechanical issues and lost his phone signal. He'd complete the delivery to Chicago just a day late. They weren't happy, but they accepted it. Marcus completed the rest of the trip without incident. But he never drove through that section of Highway 94 in Minnesota again. He specifically requested routes that avoided it, even when it meant extra miles and lost time. Other drivers noticed his reluctance to take runs through southern Minnesota, and Marcus made up excuses about bad traffic, construction delays, anything to avoid admitting the truth. Because the truth was that Highway 94, somewhere between Interstate 90 and the Iowa border, didn't exist in any single stable form. It was a shifting interchange between multiple timelines, multiple versions of the same road, all occupying the same physical space. And Marcus Donovan was one of the few people who could perceive that instability, who had experienced firsthand the impossibility of a road that was everywhere and nowhere at once. Years later, Marcus heard about other drivers who'd had similar experiences in that area. Stories of highways that changed without warning, of roads that led nowhere, of mile markers that repeated or vanished. Most drivers chalked it up to exhaustion or confusion, but Marcus knew better. Some places, some stretches of highway existed outside the normal rules. Highway 94 was one of them, and Marcus considered himself lucky to have escaped with nothing more than lost time and a profound unease about the nature of reality itself. Story 3. The Midnight Passenger. Jennifer Cole had been driving regional routes across the Pacific Northwest for 14 years when she picked up the passenger who couldn't exist. It happened in September of 2024, on a delivery run from Portland to Spokane. The cargo was medical equipment, temperature-sensitive and expensive, which meant no delays and no room for mistakes. Jennifer had hauled similar loads dozens of times, always on schedule, always professional. She took pride in her reliability. She left Portland just after 7 p.m., the freight liner loaded and balanced, paperwork in order, GPS showing an estimated arrival in Spokane around 4 a.m. The route took her east on Interstate 84 through the Columbia River Gorge, then north into Washington. It was a beautiful drive during daylight, but at night it was mostly just darkness punctuated by occasional small towns. Jennifer didn't mind. She'd driven these roads so many times she could navigate them in her sleep. The first few hours were routine. Light traffic, clear weather, no issues with the truck. Jennifer listened to an audiobook, sipped coffee from her thermos, and maintained a steady 65 miles per hour. Around 10 p.m., passing through a particularly remote section between Biggs Junction and Maryhill, she noticed something on the shoulder ahead. A figure standing next to the road illuminated by her headlights. As Jennifer got closer, she could see it was a woman, maybe in her 30s, wearing a dark dress and waving one arm slowly, trying to flag down help. Jennifer's first instinct was to keep driving. She'd been warned many times about stopping for hitchhikers, especially at night in remote areas. Too many stories of drivers being robbed or worse. But something about this woman made Jennifer hesitate. She looked genuinely distressed, not threatening. And it was cold out, maybe 40 degrees, too cold to be standing on a highway shoulder in a thin dress. Jennifer made a split-second decision and pulled onto the shoulder about 50 yards past the woman, checking her mirrors and applying the air brakes carefully. The woman approached the passenger side of the cab and Jennifer lowered the window. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman nodded. "My car broke down a few miles back. I've been walking for over an hour. Please, I just need a ride to the next town. I can call someone from there." Jennifer hesitated again. This violated every safety protocol she'd ever learned. But the woman looked harmless, desperate, and freezing. "Okay, climb in. I'm heading east. Can drop you at the next truck stop." The woman smiled with relief and opened the passenger door. Jennifer noticed her hands were shaking from the cold as she climbed into the cab. "Thank you so much. I was starting to think no one would stop." Jennifer pulled back onto the highway and glanced at her passenger. In the dim light of the cab, the woman looked ordinary. Shoulder-length brown hair, pale skin, dark eyes. Her dress was nicer than Jennifer would have expected for someone whose car had broken down, more like something you'd wear to a dinner party than a road trip. But Jennifer didn't comment. People's choices were their own. "What happened to your car?" Jennifer asked, making conversation. The woman was silent for a moment, staring out the windshield at the dark highway. "I'm not sure. It just stopped working. Engine died, wouldn't restart. I left it on the shoulder about 3 miles back." "Did you call for a tow?" My phone is dead. I was hoping to find a gas station or something. Jennifer nodded. Next town is about 20 miles. There's a truck stop there with phones, towing service, the works. I'll get you there. The woman smiled again. Thank you. You're very kind. They drove in silence for a while. Jennifer kept noticing strange things about her passenger. The woman wasn't wearing a seatbelt, which Jennifer mentioned, but the woman just smiled and said she'd put it on in a minute, though she never did. The woman didn't seem cold anymore, despite having been standing outside in 40-degree weather. And there was something odd about the way she sat. Perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead without blinking. Around 10:30, Jennifer noticed something that made her stomach tighten. She'd adjusted her mirror to get a better view of the road, and in doing so, she'd angled it to catch a glimpse of the passenger seat. Except the mirror showed the seat as empty. No passenger. Just an empty seat with the landscape passing by outside the window. Jennifer blinked and looked directly at the woman. She was still there, sitting calmly, hands folded. But when Jennifer glanced back at the mirror, it showed an empty seat. Jennifer tried adjusting the mirror, thinking maybe it was the angle, but no matter how she positioned it, the reflection never showed the passenger. "Is everything okay?" the woman asked, noticing Jennifer's repeated mirror adjustments. Jennifer forced a smile. "Yeah, fine. Just checking the trailer." But her hands were gripping the steering wheel tighter now, and she could feel her heart rate increasing. Something was very wrong. People didn't disappear from mirrors. That wasn't possible. Jennifer tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the lighting in the cab, some trick of reflection that made the passenger seat appear empty. Maybe the woman was sitting at an angle that happened to be out of the mirror's view. But Jennifer knew those explanations didn't make sense. The mirror showed the entire passenger seat. If the woman was there, the reflection should show her. "How far to the next town?" the woman asked. Jennifer checked the GPS. "About 15 miles now." The woman nodded slowly. "That's good. I appreciate the ride. Not many people would stop for a stranger at night." "What's your name?" Jennifer asked, suddenly wanting to know something concrete about this passenger. The woman paused as if she had to think about it. "Sarah. My name is Sarah. I'm Jennifer. Where are you headed, Sarah, after you get your car fixed?" "East," Sarah said simply. "Just east, as far as the road goes." That answer made Jennifer's unease deepen. It was too vague, too strange. People didn't just drive east until the road ended. They had destinations, specific places they were going. But before Jennifer could ask more questions, Sarah changed the subject. "Have you been driving long? You seem very comfortable behind the wheel." 14 years, Jennifer replied. "Started when I was 25, been doing it ever since." "Do you like it? Being on the road all the time?" Jennifer thought about that. "Most of the time, yeah, it's peaceful. I like the solitude, the sense of going somewhere. Gets lonely sometimes, but mostly I enjoy it." Sarah nodded. "Loneliness is interesting. You can be surrounded by people and still feel alone. Or you can be completely alone and feel connected to everything." Jennifer glanced at her passenger. "That's pretty philosophical for a broken-down car situation." Sarah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I've had a lot of time to think lately. More time than I expected." They fell into silence again. Jennifer kept checking the mirror, and each time it showed an empty passenger seat. She tried not to look at Sarah directly, tried not to think about what it meant that her passenger had no reflection. Maybe she was hallucinating. Maybe the stress and fatigue were causing her to see things that weren't there. But the woman seemed so real, so solid. Jennifer could hear her breathing, could see the slight movement of her chest rising and falling. Around 11 p.m., they approached the outskirts of the next town. Jennifer saw the lights of the truck stop ahead and felt relief. She'd drop Sarah off, and this strange encounter would be over. But as they got closer, Sarah spoke again. "You don't need to stop. I've changed my mind." Jennifer frowned. "But your car, it's fine. I'll handle it another way. Just keep driving." "Sarah, you need to call someone. Get your car towed." "Keep driving," Sarah repeated, her voice firmer now, almost commanding. Jennifer felt a chill run down her spine. She should stop anyway, should insist that Sarah get out at the truck stop. But something in the woman's tone made Jennifer obey. She drove past the truck stop back onto the dark highway, continuing east. "Why did you really stop for me?" Sarah asked after a few minutes. Jennifer thought about lying, but something told her this passenger would know. "I don't know. You looked like you needed help, and I guess I've been there before, stranded and hoping someone would stop. Seemed like the right thing to do. Even though you knew it was dangerous, even though you'd been told never to pick up hitchhikers?" "Yeah, even though." Sarah nodded slowly. "That's why I chose your truck. I've been standing on that shoulder for a long time, watching drivers pass. Most don't even slow down. Some slow down but then speed up again when they see me clearly, but you stopped. You chose to help." Jennifer's hands were shaking now. "Chose your truck? What does that mean? How long have you been out there?" Sarah turned to look at Jennifer directly for the first time. Her eyes were dark, impossibly dark, like looking into deep water at night. "Time is different for me now. What feels like days might be years, or the other way around. It's hard to tell anymore." "Sarah, what are you talking about? Are you okay?" "I was in an accident," Sarah said quietly. "Right around here, actually. September of 2019. A semi crossed the center line, hit my car head on. I died instantly, or so they told me later. Except I didn't really die, I just changed, got stuck." Jennifer wanted to pull over, wanted to stop the truck and demand answers, but her body wouldn't obey. She kept driving, hands on the wheel, eyes on the road. "You're saying you're a ghost? I don't know what I am. Ghost is as good a word as any. I've been trying to move on, trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do. But I keep ending up back on this highway, at that same spot where the accident happened. I watch drivers pass by night after night. Most can't see me, but some can. You can." Jennifer checked the mirror again. Still empty. "That's why I don't have a reflection." "Yes. Mirrors show what is, not what appears. You see an appearance. The mirror sees reality." "This isn't happening," Jennifer whispered. "I'm hallucinating. Too much coffee, not enough sleep. This isn't real." "It's real," Sarah said gently. "I'm sorry, I know it's frightening, but I needed you to see me. Needed someone to acknowledge that I'm still here, still existing in some form. 5 years I've been on this road, and you're the first person who stopped." Jennifer felt tears on her face, though she didn't remember starting to cry. "What do you want from me?" "Just this. Just a conversation, a few miles of company. I get so lonely out there watching everyone drive past like I don't exist. It helps to be seen, to be remembered." They drove in silence for several more miles. Jennifer's mind was racing, trying to process what was happening, trying to decide if any of this could be real. But Sarah seemed so calm, so present, even without a reflection. And Jennifer could feel her there, could sense her presence in the cab. "Where are you going?" Sarah asked. "After Spokane, I mean. Where does the road take you next?" "Back to Portland," Jennifer said. "I have another delivery scheduled for Friday. And after that, another delivery, then another. That's how it works. I just keep moving, keep delivering, keep driving." Sarah smiled sadly. "That sounds familiar. I used to do something similar, always moving, always going somewhere. Never stopping long enough to appreciate where I was." I thought there would always be more time. Turned out I was wrong. Is there a message you want me to deliver? Jennifer asked. Family, friends, someone I can tell about meeting you? No. They held a funeral, mourned, moved on. That's how it should be. I don't want to disturb that. I just needed one person to know I'm still here, still thinking and feeling and experiencing things, even if I'm not alive in the traditional sense. Around midnight, Sarah spoke again. This is far enough. You can let me out at the next mile marker. Sarah, there's nothing out here. It's just empty highway. That's okay. This is where I belong now. The highway, the darkness, the passing lights, it's my home. Jennifer pulled onto the shoulder at mile marker 97, the same way she'd stopped to pick Sarah up 3 hours earlier. The woman opened the passenger door and climbed out, moving with the same graceful precision she'd shown throughout the ride. Thank you, Jennifer, Sarah said, standing on the shoulder. For stopping, for listening, for seeing me. It means more than you know. Will you be okay? Jennifer asked, knowing the question was absurd but needing to ask anyway. Sarah smiled. I'll be what I am. Take care of yourself. Drive safely. She closed the door and stepped back from the truck. Jennifer checked her mirrors, preparing to merge back onto the highway. When she glanced at the passenger side mirror to ensure it was clear, she saw Sarah standing on the shoulder, clearly visible in the reflection for the first time. The woman raised one hand in a small wave, then turned and walked into the darkness beyond the shoulder, disappearing from view within seconds. Jennifer pulled back onto the highway and drove for another hour before she allowed herself to fully process what had happened. She'd picked up a ghost, had a conversation with a dead woman, and somehow both had survived the encounter. It should have terrified her, should have made her question her sanity. But instead, Jennifer felt an odd sense of peace. She completed the delivery to Spokane on schedule, unloading the medical equipment without incident. On the return trip to Portland, Jennifer drove past the spot where she'd picked up Sarah. She slowed down, looking for any sign of the woman, but the shoulder was empty. Just dark pavement and the occasional reflective marker, nothing more. Jennifer never told anyone about Sarah. She knew how it would sound, knew people would think she'd fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing. But Jennifer knew the truth. She'd met someone caught between life and death, someone who still existed in some form on the highway she'd died on. And for 3 hours, Jennifer had given that person companionship, acknowledgement, and a sense of being seen. In the years that followed, Jennifer made that Portland to Spokane run dozens more times. She always slowed down at mile marker 97, always checked the shoulder, always hoped to see Sarah standing there again. But the woman never reappeared. Maybe she'd finally moved on, finally found whatever peace she'd been seeking. Or maybe she was still out there waiting for another driver who could see her, who would stop despite the danger, who would offer a few miles of company to someone who had nowhere else to go. Jennifer preferred to believe Sarah had moved on, but sometimes late at night on that same stretch of highway, she'd catch a glimpse of something in her mirrors, a figure standing on the shoulder watching the traffic pass, waiting for someone who could see beyond the ordinary rules of reality. And each time Jennifer would slow down, would check the shoulder carefully, would be ready to stop if that figure raised a hand and flagged her down. Because Jennifer Cole had learned that the highway held more than just pavement and paint. It held memories, echoes, remnants of lives that had ended too soon. And sometimes, if you were willing to look closely enough, willing to see beyond what should be possible, you could offer those remnants a moment of connection, a brief respite from their endless waiting. That was worth the risk, worth the fear, worth the uncertainty of not knowing what was real and what was impossible. The midnight passenger had taught Jennifer that the road connected more than just cities. It connected the living and the dead, the present and the past, the possible and the impossible. And that made every mile, every delivery, every lonely stretch of dark highway something more than just distance covered. It made them opportunities for encounters that transcended the ordinary boundaries of existence. Story 4. The Way Station That Moved. Thomas Garrett spent 19 years as a long-haul trucker before he encountered the way station that existed in more than one location simultaneously. The incident occurred in May of 2023, during a haul from El Paso to Oklahoma City. The load was construction materials, heavy steel beams and concrete forms, pushing his total weight right up to the 80,000-pound legal limit. It meant mandatory stops at every way station, no bypassing, no exceptions. Thomas had run this route at least 50 times over his career. He knew every way station, every inspection point, every place where the authorities set up to check weights and paperwork. The system was straightforward. Approach the station, follow the truck lane, stop on the scale, wait for clearance, then continue. Simple, routine, boring. Thomas had never had problems at way stations. His truck was maintained, his paperwork was always in order, and he drove carefully to avoid any citations. He crossed into New Mexico around 2 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, the Kenworth running smoothly, the load secured and balanced. The first New Mexico way station was about 40 miles ahead near the town of Santa Rosa. Thomas had stopped there dozens of times. It was a modern facility, well-staffed, efficient. He expected to be through it in less than 10 minutes. The sign appeared right on schedule. Way station ahead. All trucks must stop. Thomas moved into the right lane and began slowing down. The station came into view. A single-story building painted white, with multiple lanes for trucks to pull onto the scales. It looked exactly as Thomas remembered it. But as he approached the entrance, something felt wrong. The station looked right, but the surroundings were different. The landscape was too flat, too empty. There should have been a gas station visible across the highway, a cluster of billboards advertising motels and restaurants. Instead, there was just open prairie stretching to the horizon. Thomas dismissed the feeling and pulled into the way station. He followed the signs directing him onto the scales, stopped when the light turned red, and waited. Through his windshield, he could see into the station office. Two figures moved inside wearing what appeared to be official uniforms, but something about them looked off. The proportions were wrong somehow, too tall or too thin. Thomas attributed it to the angle and the glare on the windows. After about 2 minutes, the light turned green and an electronic sign lit up. Proceed. Thomas put the truck in gear and drove forward, exiting the way station and merging back onto the highway. He checked his GPS to see how much farther to Oklahoma City. The screen showed him at mile marker 98 on Interstate 40 exactly where he should be. But 10 minutes later, Thomas saw another sign. Way station ahead. All trucks must stop. He frowned. There shouldn't be another way station for at least 100 miles. New Mexico only had a few, and they were spaced far apart. Maybe there was construction, a temporary inspection point. Those popped up sometimes for special enforcement operations. Thomas slowed down and moved into the right lane again. The station came into view, and Thomas felt his chest tighten. It was the same station, the exact same white building, the same layout of lanes and scales. He could even see the same dent in the metal railing near the entrance, a detail he'd noticed at the previous station. "That's not possible," Thomas said aloud. He checked his odometer. He'd driven 11 miles since leaving the first way station. He couldn't have somehow turned around or ended up back at the same location. The highway had been straight, with no exits or turnoffs. Thomas pulled into the station anyway, following the same procedure. He drove onto the scales, stopped at the red light, and waited. Through the windshield, he saw the same two figures moving in the office, tall and thin, their movements oddly synchronized. This time, Thomas paid closer attention. The figures weren't wearing normal uniforms. The clothes were the right color, had the right general shape, but there were no visible badges, no name tags, no details. Just solid blocks of color in humanoid form. The light turned green. The sign read, "Proceed." Thomas drove forward and merged back onto the highway. He immediately grabbed his CB radio. "Breaker 19, this is Running Bear eastbound on I-40 in New Mexico. Any drivers in the area? You got your ears on?" Static answered him. Thomas tried several more times, switching channels, calling out on the emergency frequency. No response. The highway ahead was empty too, no other vehicles visible in either direction. That was unusual for mid-afternoon on a major interstate. There should have been traffic, even light traffic. Thomas drove for another 15 minutes, watching his odometer carefully. When he'd covered approximately 12 miles, another sign appeared. "Way station ahead. All trucks must stop." "No," Thomas said, "no way." But there it was, the same station, the same white building. He couldn't avoid it without violating the law, and Thomas had maintained a clean driving record for 19 years. He wasn't about to compromise that now, even for something as bizarre as a way station that kept appearing. He pulled in for the third time. Everything happened exactly as before. The scales, the red light, the figures in the office, the green light, the "Proceed" sign. Thomas drove through faster this time, accelerating hard as soon as he was clear of the station, trying to put distance between himself and whatever this phenomenon was. But 12 miles later, there was the sign again. Thomas pulled onto the shoulder before reaching the station entrance, put the truck in park, and grabbed his phone. No signal. The screen showed 0 bars, and the GPS app was spinning endlessly, unable to acquire a location. He tried restarting the phone. Same result. No connection, no data, no location services. Thomas got out of the cab and stood on the shoulder, looking at the way station ahead. It sat there approximately 500 yards away, looking completely normal except for the total absence of any other buildings, vehicles, or signs of human activity beyond the station itself. The landscape around it was empty prairie, nothing else visible for miles in any direction. He got back in the truck and continued forward, pulling into the way station for the 4th time. As he sat on the scales waiting for the light to change, Thomas decided to try something different. When the light turned green, instead of proceeding through normally, Thomas stopped in the exit lane. He put the truck in park and waited, watching to see if anyone would come out of the office to investigate why he wasn't moving. Nothing happened. The figures in the office continued their synchronized movements, paying no attention to Thomas sitting stationary in the exit lane. After 5 minutes of waiting, Thomas got out of the cab and walked toward the office building. He wanted to talk to someone, to demand an explanation, to confirm that real human beings were operating this station. As he got closer to the building, Thomas noticed more strange details. The windows weren't really windows. They were smooth surfaces painted to look like glass with vague shapes behind them, suggesting interiors that didn't actually exist. The door to the office had no handle, no hinges, no mechanism for opening. It was just a door-shaped section of wall. Thomas reached out to touch the building's exterior wall. His hand passed through it as if it were made of smoke. There was no substance, no solid material. The entire building was a projection or illusion, a three-dimensional image with no physical reality. Thomas stumbled backward, his mind reeling. This wasn't a real way station. It was something else, some kind of phantom structure that only appeared real from a distance. But why? What purpose did it serve? And why did it keep appearing every 12 miles or so? He returned to his truck, his hands shaking as he started the engine. Thomas drove through the illusory station and back onto the highway, now understanding that he was trapped in some kind of loop. Every 12 miles, the Phantom Way station would appear and Thomas would have to pass through it to continue. But continuing just brought him back to the station again and again. As he drove, Thomas tried to make sense of what was happening. Maybe it was some kind of temporal distortion, a fold in space where the same location was repeated. Or maybe he'd somehow driven into an alternate reality where this section of highway existed in isolation, disconnected from the larger world. Or maybe he was experiencing some elaborate hallucination caused by exposure to toxic fumes from his cargo. None of the explanations felt right. This was something else, something that didn't fit into any category Thomas understood. He was caught in a phenomenon that violated the basic rules of how space and distance worked. On the sixth pass through the Phantom Station, Thomas noticed something new. One of the figures in the office turned to look directly at him as he sat on the scales. For a moment, Thomas could see its face clearly. It had human features, but they were too perfect, too symmetrical, like a computer-generated approximation of a person. The figure raised one hand in a wave, the gesture eerily mechanical. Thomas waved back without thinking, some automatic social response. The figure's mouth moved as if speaking, though Thomas couldn't hear anything. The light turned green and Thomas drove forward, more disturbed than before. Whatever those figures were, they were aware of him, tracking his repeated passages through the station. By the 10th pass, Thomas had been trapped for nearly 3 hours. His fuel gauge was dropping steadily. He'd burned through a quarter tank just driving the same 12-mile loop over and over. At this rate, he'd run out of fuel in another 6 or 7 hours. And then what? Would he be stranded here forever? Stuck at a Phantom Way station on a highway that didn't connect to anywhere? Thomas tried every variation he could think of. He drove at different speeds. He pulled over and waited for various amounts of time before continuing. He tried driving in the left lane instead of the right. He tried skipping the way station, blowing past it without stopping. None of it made any difference. Every 12 miles, the station appeared, and when Thomas tried to bypass it, his truck would lose power, the engine dying no matter how much he pressed the accelerator, forcing him to coast to a stop right at the station entrance. On the 15th pass, exhausted and desperate, Thomas decided to try something extreme. Instead of driving through the station normally, he steered his truck directly at the office building. If it was just an illusion, just smoke and projections, his truck should pass right through it, and maybe on the other side, he'd find a way out of this loop. He accelerated toward the building, the Kenworth picking up speed. The figures in the office didn't react, didn't move out of the way. They just stood there watching. Thomas braced himself for impact. The truck passed through the building as if it weren't there, exactly as Thomas had expected. But on the other side, instead of empty prairie, Thomas found himself driving through darkness. Complete, absolute darkness, the headlights revealing nothing, no road, no ground. Just infinite black void. The truck seemed to be floating, supported by nothing, moving forward through an absence of everything. Thomas slammed on the brakes. The truck slowed but didn't stop, just continued its forward motion at a decreasing rate. Eventually, it came to rest suspended in the darkness. Thomas sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding. He'd made a mistake. He'd driven off the loop, off the repeating highway, into whatever existed beyond the boundaries of the phenomenon. For several minutes, nothing happened. Thomas just sat in the suspended truck, surrounded by darkness so complete he couldn't see his own hands in front of his face. Even the lights from the dashboard seemed dimmed, as if the darkness was actively consuming illumination. Then slowly, lights began to appear in the distance. Not stars or streetlights, but geometric patterns, grids of light forming and dissolving in the void. They seemed to move closer, though it was impossible to judge distance in the featureless darkness. As they approached, Thomas could see that the patterns were complex, mathematical, three-dimensional structures that rotated and transformed as they moved. One pattern drifted close enough to touch the truck. Where it made contact, Thomas felt the vehicle shudder. The geometric lights passed through the cab, through Thomas himself, and he experienced a sensation of being examined, scanned, measured by some intelligence that processed reality as pure mathematics. Then a voice spoke, not through the radio but directly in Thomas's mind. It had no identifiable gender or accent, just pure information conveyed as language. You have left the designated path. This is not permitted. Return to the road. Thomas tried to speak, but his voice didn't work in the darkness. Instead, he thought his response, hoping whatever intelligence had spoken would receive it. I can't return. The road is a loop. I'm trapped. The loop is intentional. You must complete it. Complete it how? I've driven through 12 times, 15 times. It just keeps repeating. Continue until the condition is met. What condition? What am I supposed to do? The weight must be measured. The balance must be confirmed. Continue. Before Thomas could ask more questions, the darkness began to change. The geometric patterns faded, replaced by gradual illumination. The highway materialized around him, solid and real, the truck once again sitting on pavement rather than floating in void. Thomas checked his surroundings. He was back on Interstate 40, right at the entrance to the Phantom Way station. But something was different this time. Thomas could feel it, some subtle shift in the atmosphere. He drove onto the scales and stopped at the red light. Through the windshield, the office building looked more solid now, more real. The figures inside were gone, replaced by actual human beings in proper uniforms. One of them, a middle-aged woman with gray hair, emerged from the office and approached Thomas's truck. She was carrying a clipboard and wore a badge identifying her as an inspector for the New Mexico Department of Transportation. She looked completely normal, completely real. Good afternoon, she said, her voice clear and natural. Sorry for the delay. We've been having computer issues. Can I see your paperwork? Thomas handed over his logbook, bill of lading and registration, his hands still shaking slightly. The inspector reviewed everything carefully, making notes on her clipboard. After a few minutes, she handed the documents back. Everything looks good. Your weight is legal, within limits. You're clear to proceed. Drive safely. She returned to the office and the light turned green. Thomas drove forward, exiting the way station and merging back onto the highway. He watched his odometer carefully, counting the miles. 10 miles passed, 15 miles, 20 miles. No way station appeared. Thomas checked his GPS. It was working normally again, showing his position on Interstate 40 approaching the Texas border. His phone had signal, 4 bars, all services functioning. Traffic appeared around him, other vehicles moving at normal speeds, evidence of the ordinary world continuing its operations. Thomas pulled into the first truck stop he saw and parked. He got out and walked around his truck, checking everything. It was all normal, undamaged, exactly as it should be. He checked his fuel gauge against the receipt from his last fill-up, calculating how much he should have burned. The math didn't work. According to the fuel consumption, he'd been driving for approximately 7 hours since leaving El Paso. But according to his logbook and GPS history, only about 4 hours had passed. Somewhere in those missing 3 hours, Thomas had been caught in the Phantom Way station loop, cycling through it over and over until whatever test was being conducted had been completed. The weight must be measured, the voice had said. The balance must be confirmed. Thomas didn't know what that meant, didn't understand what balance he'd been measured against or what condition he'd finally met. He completed the delivery to Oklahoma City without further incident. But Thomas never forgot the phantom way station, never stopped wondering what it was and what purpose it served. In the months that followed, he heard stories from other drivers about similar experiences. Way stations that appeared in impossible locations, that trapped drivers in loops, that tested them in ways beyond standard weight and safety inspections. Most drivers dismissed these stories as urban legends, trucker folklore passed around at rest stops to scare rookies. But Thomas knew better. Whatever the phantom way station was, it was real. It existed outside the normal infrastructure of highways and regulations, operating according to rules that had nothing to do with state transportation departments. Thomas continued driving for 2 more years after the incident, but he always felt uneasy approaching way stations, especially the one near Santa Rosa, New Mexico. Each time he pulled in, he half expected to find himself trapped in the loop again, cycling endlessly while geometric patterns measured his weight against some cosmic balance he couldn't comprehend. He retired from long-haul trucking in 2025, taking a job as a local delivery driver that kept him within 50 miles of home. His wife asked why he gave up the long routes when they paid so much better. Thomas told her he was ready for a change, ready to be home more often. But the real reason was simpler. He'd encountered something on the highway that had shaken his faith in the stability of reality itself. The phantom way station had shown Thomas that the roads he'd driven for 19 years contained spaces where the rules changed, where distance became negotiable and time became fluid, where measurements were taken not just of weight and cargo, but of something deeper, something fundamental about the nature of drivers and the loads they carried through America's infrastructure of highways and emptiness. Thomas never learned what that deeper measurement was, never understood what balance was being confirmed, but he knew he'd pass the test, whatever it was. The weight had been measured, the balance had been confirmed, and Thomas Garrett had been released back onto the ordinary highways, where way stations stayed in one place and measuring meant checking tonnage against legal limits. Nothing more mysterious than that. Story 5. The radio broadcast from nowhere. Catherine Wells had been driving cross-country routes for 16 years when she picked up the CB radio broadcast that couldn't exist. It happened in July of 2024 during a run from Phoenix to Memphis hauling electronics. The cargo was valuable, time-sensitive, and required constant temperature control. Catherine had made similar runs dozens of times without issue. She was experienced, reliable, and meticulous about maintaining her equipment. She left Phoenix around 9 p.m. to avoid the worst of the desert heat, the Volvo running smoothly, the refrigeration unit keeping the trailer at a constant 65 degrees. The route took her northeast on Interstate 40 through Arizona and into New Mexico. It was a straightforward drive 700 miles to her scheduled rest stop in Amarillo, Texas. The first few hours were quiet. Catherine listened to a true crime podcast, checked in with dispatch at regular intervals, and maintained a steady 65 miles per hour. Around midnight, crossing the border from Arizona into New Mexico, she turned on her CB radio. She liked having it on during night drives, the occasional chatter of other truckers providing a sense of connection on the empty highways. At first, the CB was mostly static. Catherine was between towns in one of those vast stretches of western landscape where radio signals struggled to reach. She scanned through channels looking for any traffic but found only white noise. Then on Channel 19, the standard trucker channel, she picked up a voice. The voice belonged to a man, middle-aged with a slight drawl. But something about it sounded wrong. The audio quality was different from normal CB transmissions, tinnier and more distant, like listening to an old recording played through damaged speakers. The words he spoke didn't match current conditions. He was reporting deteriorating weather, reduced visibility, conditions that didn't exist on the clear July night Catherine was driving through. Another voice answered, "This one female." She confirmed the same hazardous conditions, mentioned snow coming down heavy. Catherine checked her windshield. The night was clear, stars visible, temperature reading 76 degrees. There was no snow, no weather system that could produce snow in July in the New Mexico desert. A third voice cut in, identifying itself as Highway Patrol. All commercial vehicles on Highway 66 between Gallup and Albuquerque should seek shelter immediately. Road conditions were hazardous. Multiple accidents reported, travel not advised. Catherine picked up her CB handset. Breaker 19, this is Desert Fox eastbound on I-40 in New Mexico. Anyone talking about snow conditions, please identify your location. Static. Then a different voice, male, younger. Desert Fox, we don't have you on our screens. Repeat your location. I'm on Interstate 40, approximately 30 miles west of Gallup. Who is this? More static than the original male voice. Interstate 40? There's no Interstate 40 out here. You must be confused. We're on Highway 66 dealing with a major winter storm. If you're in the area, find shelter. Catherine felt ice in her stomach. Highway 66, the old Route 66, had been decommissioned decades ago, replaced by Interstate 40. The old highway still existed in sections, maintained as a historic route, but it wasn't used for commercial traffic anymore. No one referred to it as an active highway, and the terminology they were using, the way they spoke about the highway, sounded authentically vintage. "What year is this?" Catherine asked, the question sounding absurd even as she said it. Silence on the radio. Then the female voice. "It's December 19th, 1967. What kind of question is that?" 1967. Catherine's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She was picking up CB transmissions from 57 years in the past. Conversations among truckers driving Route 66 during a snowstorm in December of 1967. It wasn't possible. Radio waves didn't travel backward through time. This violated every principle of physics she understood. "I don't understand what's happening," Catherine said into the handset. "This is July of 2024. I'm driving a modern semi on Interstate 40. The younger male voice came back. "Lady, have you been drinking? You're not making any sense. It's December, we're in a blizzard, and there's no such thing as Interstate 40. Maybe you should pull over and get some rest." Catherine released the handset and just listened. The voices continued their conversation, discussing road conditions, accident locations, recommendations for where to stop, and wait out the storm. They were clearly experiencing a specific event, a real snowstorm happening in real time for them. But that time was 1967, more than half a century ago. Catherine switched to Channel 9, the emergency channel. Different voices, same era. Someone reporting a vehicle fire. Someone else requesting medical assistance. A highway patrol officer coordinating emergency responses. All of them speaking as if it were December 19th, 1967. Dealing with an actual crisis unfolding in real time. She tried her phone, thinking maybe she could call someone, verify that it was actually 2024 and she hadn't somehow fallen into a temporal anomaly. But her phone showed no signal. The screen displayed the correct date and time, July 7th, 2024, 12:37 a.m., but no cellular connection available. Catherine switched back to Channel 19. The original male voice was speaking about highway closures. All commercial vehicles should divert north or south. Do not attempt to proceed east on 66. "Excuse me," Catherine interrupted. "This is Desert Fox again. Can any of you see forward in time? Do you know what happens next after 1967? Silence. Then the female voice, sounding annoyed. "We're trying to coordinate emergency responses here. Please clear the channel for official traffic." Catherine started to apologize, but before she could speak, a new voice cut in. This one was different from all the others. deeper, more resonant, with an odd echoing quality that made it sound like it was coming from multiple speakers simultaneously. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, overlaying all the other transmissions. "Catherine Wells, you are not supposed to be hearing this." Catherine froze. The voice had used her name, her actual name. "Who is this? How do you know who I am?" "You have accessed a temporal spillover, radio signals bleeding through from a different timeline. This is not intentional. You should not have been able to hear these transmissions. What are you? Are you from 1967 or from now or from somewhere else? I am the corrective measure. The anomaly will be closed. Continue your route on Interstate 40. Do not attempt to access these frequencies again." The CB radio went dead. Not static, not silence between transmissions, but completely dead. Catherine tried adjusting the controls, cycling through channels, turning it off and on. Nothing worked. The radio was no longer functional, as if something had remotely shut it down. Catherine drove in silence for the next hour, mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. She'd heard conversations from 1967, actual voices from truckers who were probably dead now, preserved somehow in electromagnetic form and broadcast forward through time. And then something else, something that called itself a corrective measure, had shut down her access to those transmissions. Around 2 a.m., approaching Gallup, Catherine noticed something strange about the highway. For a brief moment, the pavement changed. The modern 4-lane interstate became a narrower 2-lane road, the kind that would have existed in the 1960s. The highway markings were different, older style, and the weather changed too. Clear summer night became snowy darkness. Heavy snowflakes illuminated in Catherine's headlights, accumulating on the road surface. The transformation lasted maybe 5 seconds, then everything snapped back to normal. Modern highway again, clear weather, summer night. But in those 5 seconds, Catherine had seen what the truckers from 1967 had been driving through. A genuine blizzard. Dangerous conditions, visibility measured in feet rather than miles. It was exactly as hazardous as they had described. Catherine pulled into a truck stop in Gallup and parked. She got out, walked around her truck, checked everything. The night was warm in the 70s, no trace of snow anywhere. But Catherine knew what she'd seen. The two timelines had overlapped briefly, allowing her to experience a moment from 1967 superimposed on her present. Inside the truck stop, Catherine asked the clerk if there had been any strange weather in the area, any unusual reports. The clerk, a man in his 60s, shook his head. "Clear night, been clear all day. Why you asking?" "Just curious. You ever hear about a bad snowstorm on Route 66 back in December of 1967? The clerk's expression changed, becoming more interested and somber. "Now that's specific. I wasn't living here then, but yeah, there was a famous storm that year. Caught a lot of trucks off guard. Several accidents. I think a couple drivers died. It's kind of a legend around here. Why?" Catherine didn't know how to answer. How could she explain that she'd just heard transmissions from that storm, heard the voices of truckers dealing with it in real time, heard them asking for help and coordinating rescue efforts? "I just heard something about it, wondering if it was real." "Oh, it was real," the clerk said. "My grandfather was a trucker back then. He nearly got caught in that storm, but managed to find shelter before it got bad. He used to tell stories about it for years. Said it was one of the scariest nights of his life." Catherine bought coffee and a sandwich and returned to her truck. She didn't try to use the CB radio for the rest of the night. The corrective measure, whatever it was, had made it clear she shouldn't access those frequencies again. But as Catherine drove east through New Mexico, she kept glancing at the radio, wondering if the voices from 1967 were still transmitting. still replaying that catastrophic night, eternally caught in the moment before disaster. She wondered if the corrective measure was trying to prevent interference, to keep past and present separated, or if it was monitoring her, making sure she didn't attempt to communicate with that earlier timeline again. Either way, Catherine understood the warning. Some things weren't meant to be seen or heard across the barriers of time. Catherine completed the delivery to Memphis without further incident. But she never turned on a CB radio again, never tried to access any frequency, and she always maintained awareness when driving through areas where temporal anomalies might occur, watching for any signs that the past was bleeding through into the present. She eventually learned that other truckers had experienced similar things on various stretches of highway across America. Broadcasts from different eras, voices from drivers who had died decades ago, conversations that seemed impossible yet undeniably real. It was as if certain highways, certain stretches of road, had become thin places where time could slip, where the barriers between different moments could become permeable. Catherine never understood why this happened or what the corrective measure was. But she knew that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, some knowledge too dangerous to pursue. The radio broadcast from 1967 had shown her that the present wasn't as solid, as fixed in time as she'd always believed. And that revelation, once received, couldn't be unlearned. Story 6. The Phantom Hitchhiker's Destination. David Morrison had been driving long-haul routes for 23 years when he picked up the hitchhiker who claimed to be traveling to a town that didn't exist anymore. It was April of 2025, and David was hauling farm equipment from Des Moines to Dallas, a straightforward run through Oklahoma that he'd completed at least 100 times over his career. The weather was decent. The truck was running well, and David was making good time. Around dusk, driving through the emptiest part of Oklahoma, David spotted a figure on the shoulder. A young man, maybe late 20s, with a backpack, thumb out. David didn't usually pick up hitchhikers. It violated company policy and most truckers' safety guidelines. But something about this particular hitchhiker made David slow down. The young man had a desperate quality to him, an urgency that suggested he'd been waiting a long time. As David pulled the rig onto the shoulder, the hitchhiker ran toward the truck with almost frantic energy. He was wearing clothes that looked expensive but worn, like something from a decade ago that had been through a lot of washing. "Thanks for stopping," the hitchhiker said, climbing into the cab. His name was James, he said. He was trying to get to his hometown to see his mother before she passed away. He'd been on the road for 3 days, but couldn't seem to get anyone to take him all the way. David found himself sympathetic to the story and offered to take James as far south as he was going. James settled into the passenger seat and David continued driving. The young man was talkative at first, sharing details about his life, his job in California, his mother's illness. But as the miles accumulated, James became quieter, more withdrawn. He kept staring out the window at the darkening landscape, his jaw clenched. "Where exactly is your hometown?" David asked after about an hour of driving. "Millbrook," James said. "It's south of here, off Highway 77. Population was about 3,000 back when I was growing up." David knew the Oklahoma highway system well and was certain he'd never heard of a town called Millbrook. Never heard of it. How far off the highway? About 15 miles east. Really small place. Most people haven't heard of it unless they grew up there or had family there. James paused. Honestly, it's probably not even there anymore. Town was dying when I left. Might be a ghost town by now. They drove in silence for another hour. David took the turn toward Highway 77 when James directed him, heading into rural Oklahoma. The landscape was flat, empty, with occasional ranch houses visible in the distance. But there were no signs for a town called Millbrook. It should be coming up soon, James said, leaning forward, straining to see through the darkness. Maybe another 10 miles. They drove 10 miles. Nothing, no town, no signs, no indication of habitation. Just empty highway stretching through darkness. Keep going, James insisted. It's definitely here, has to be. David continued driving, but his unease was growing. Something was wrong. The hitchhiker's tone had become almost panicked, desperate in a way that suggested he knew something wasn't right but was hoping it would work out anyway. Stop the truck, James said suddenly. Just stop. David pulled onto the shoulder and stopped. James got out and walked around, looking at the landscape surrounding them. The young man's movements became increasingly frantic. He walked into the darkness beside the road, disappearing from David's sight for several minutes before returning. It's gone, James said when he got back in the cab. The whole town is gone. I know this is where it should be. I recognize the terrain, the way the land sits, but there's nothing here, just empty fields. David felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean it's gone? A town doesn't just disappear. I know how it sounds, James said. His voice was hollow now, defeated. But I swear there was a town here. Millbrook, population 3,000. My childhood home was here. My mother still lives here, was living here. She was supposed to still be here. David didn't know what to do. The hitchhiker was clearly distressed, but David couldn't help him find a town that didn't seem to exist. Look, I can take you back to the highway. Get you to a town where you can make some calls, figure out what's going on. Maybe there's been some confusion about the name or location. James nodded slowly, as if coming to terms with something. Yeah, okay. Let's go back. David turned the truck around and headed back to Highway 77. But as they drove, James started speaking quietly, almost to himself. He talked about his childhood, about playing in Millbrook streets, about the high school where he'd gone to class, about walking home from school past the courthouse and the bank and the church on Main Street. He described the town in remarkable detail. The population sign that claimed 3,000 residents, the exact layout of the streets, the names of businesses that operated there. David listened to all of it, and the more James described, the more David became convinced that the town had indeed existed at some point. But it had disappeared, and David had no explanation for how such a thing could happen. When did you last visit? David asked. James was quiet for a long moment. I'm not sure. It's strange because I can remember leaving. I remember driving away from Millbrook on Highway 77 heading for California. I was 22 years old. But I can't remember how long ago that was. It feels like it was both yesterday and decades ago. They reached the highway and David headed north back toward the main routes. James sat silently, staring at his hands. As they drove, David noticed something odd about his passenger. The young man seemed to be becoming slightly transparent, as if he was fading, becoming less solid with each passing mile. Do you feel okay? David asked, alarmed. James looked at his hands, now clearly visible through them as if they were becoming glass. I think I died, he said quietly. In California, I think I died. There was an accident, a car accident on the interstate, and I've been trying to get back to Millbrook ever since. Trying to see my mother one more time before she passes, trying to go home. David pulled onto the shoulder again, his hands shaking. James, you're not making sense. You're sitting here talking to me. You're solid. You're real. I'm real, James agreed, but not in the way you mean. I died, but I didn't move on. I got stuck. And I've been trying to get back to Millbrook for what feels like forever. But every time I get close, the town isn't there. Every year I try, every time someone stops to pick me up, every time I make it back to this place, I find nothing. By this point, James was nearly invisible. David could see through him almost completely. The hitchhiker looked sad rather than frightened, as if he'd finally accepted something he'd been denying for a long time. "The town is gone because I'm gone," James continued. "Millbrook only existed in the past, and I'm trapped between the present and that past. I keep trying to return, keep hoping I'll find my way back, but I can't. I'm disconnected from time, from space, from everything that mattered." "What happened to the town?" David whispered. "Why did it disappear?" "It didn't disappear," James said. "It died. Slowly at first, then all at once. I left for California in 1999 and I died in 2018. By then, Millbrook was already abandoned. I just didn't want to accept it. I wanted to believe that if I could get back there, if I could see my mother one more time, everything would be okay. But my mother died in 2019, a year after I did. And Millbrook was officially abandoned in 2021 when the last residents moved out." David couldn't process what he was hearing. But looking at James, seeing him fade with each passing moment, David understood that something beyond normal reality was happening. The hitchhiker was a ghost, a spirit trapped between death and unresolved longing, trying to return to a place that no longer existed. "I should let you go," James said. "Stop bothering living people with my stuck situation. But I'm so tired of being alone, so tired of trying to find something that isn't there anymore." James was barely visible now, just a faint outline in the passenger seat. David reached over without thinking and tried to put his hand on the hitchhiker's arm, but his fingers passed through the transparent form. "Maybe you can find peace," David said. "Maybe you don't need to go back to Millbrook. Maybe you can just move forward, accept what happened, and let go." James smiled sadly. "I've been trying to do that for 7 years. It's not so easy when you're trapped halfway between one moment and the next." He paused. "Thank you, though, for picking me up, for listening, for treating me like I mattered. Most people can't see me at all, can't sense that I'm there. It's nice to be acknowledged, even if just for one ride." James faded completely as they spoke, becoming nothing more than a wisp of presence in the cab. David felt the passenger door open and close, felt the truck shift slightly as if weight had been removed. When David looked at the passenger seat, it was completely empty. David sat there for several minutes, trying to understand what had just happened. Then he started the truck again and continued south toward Dallas, carrying only his cargo of farm equipment and the memory of a conversation with someone who'd been dead for years but couldn't seem to accept it. At the next truck stop, David made calls and looked up information on the internet. Millbrook, Oklahoma had indeed existed. It had been abandoned in the early 2020s as the last residents moved away seeking better opportunities elsewhere. Population had dwindled from nearly 5,000 at its peak in the 1980s to less than 50 by the time it was officially abandoned. There was no record of anyone named James, but David didn't need confirmation. He'd experienced something he couldn't explain, encountered a spirit trapped between worlds, unable to accept the passage of time and the change of places. And somehow giving that spirit a ride, listening to its story, acknowledging its existence, had been the gift James had needed. David never picked up another hitchhiker after that night. But he thought often about James and Millbrook, wondering how many other spirits were out there, trapped at specific locations, trying to return to places that no longer existed, unable to accept that time had moved on without them. The highway, David learned, was full of such tragedies. Not all of them were as peaceful as James's attempt to return home. Some were far more disturbing, far more dangerous. But James had been something David understood, a person caught between the past and the present, unable to move forward, unable to let go. David continued driving until he retired in 2026. And on every run through Oklahoma, particularly through that stretch where Millbrook used to be, David kept watch. He never saw James again, never encountered another hitchhiker in quite the same way. but he sometimes wondered if the spirit had finally found peace, had finally accepted that Millbrook was gone and moved on to whatever came after death, or if he was still out there trying to flag down drivers, trying to convince someone to take him home to a town that didn't exist anymore. Story 7. The Cargo That Changed. Richard Patterson had been a dedicated truck driver for 19 years, moving cargo across America with precision and reliability. But in February of 2025, he picked up a load that challenged everything he understood about the nature of containers and contents. The job came from a brokerage he'd worked with dozens of times, moving freight from a warehouse in Kansas City to a distribution center in Atlanta. The load was listed as generic merchandise, contents unspecified, sealed and documented properly. Richard had moved similar loads hundreds of times without incident. He picked up the trailer early morning on a Tuesday, performed his standard pre-haul inspection, checked the seal numbers against the bill of lading, and confirmed everything was in order. The trailer looked normal, contained nothing obviously hazardous, was properly balanced. Richard backed the tractor into place, tested the connection, and prepared to depart. But as he started the engine and prepared to move, Richard noticed something odd. The trailer felt heavier than standard merchandise should be. His suspension registered the weight as approximately 30,000 pounds, which would be about right for a loaded trailer of generic goods. But something about the weight distribution felt wrong. The center of gravity seemed off, as if the cargo was concentrated in the very back rather than distributed evenly. Richard drove to a nearby truck stop and weighed the trailer on the facility's scales. The weight came in at Auburn exactly 30,000 pounds, well within his carrying limit and properly documented on the shipping papers. Nothing to worry about, Richard decided. He was just being overly cautious, making problems where none existed. He started driving south toward Atlanta, planning to cover about 400 miles before stopping for the evening. The drive was routine for the first few hours. Interstate traffic, good weather, no issues. But around midday, Richard decided to stop at a rest area to check on the cargo, make sure the seal was still intact, ensure there had been no damage or tampering. Richard walked to the back of the trailer and examined the seal. It was exactly as it had been that morning, the number matching the documentation perfectly. But when Richard pressed his hand against the trailer wall, he felt movement inside. Not bulk cargo settling, but actual movement. Deliberate motion, as if something inside was moving around intentionally. Richard quickly moved away from the trailer. His heart was racing. Sealed containers weren't supposed to move. Cargo was packaged, secured, immobilized. There shouldn't be any movement at all. Richard returned to the cab and called his dispatcher. "I think there might be a problem with the load," Richard said. "I'm feeling movement inside the sealed trailer. Could be something shifting, but it doesn't feel right." The dispatcher checked the paperwork. "According to the documentation, that load is generic merchandise sealed since Monday." "What kind of movement?" "Like something is walking around inside. Moving deliberately, it's hard to describe. Could just be settling. Cargo shifts sometimes. Seal is intact?" "Seal is intact. Number matches perfectly, but the movement, I don't know. Something feels off." The dispatcher assured Richard that the load was properly documented and that settling was normal. Richard should continue his drive and deliver on schedule. If there were any serious issues, he could stop at the next scale house or facility and have it inspected by professionals. Richard continued driving, but the strange feeling persisted. Every hour or so, he'd hear movement from the trailer, scraping, shuffling, occasional sounds that almost seemed like impacts against the inner walls. But each time Richard stopped to check, the seal was intact, undisturbed, perfectly secured. By evening, Richard had covered about 300 miles and was getting close to Memphis. He pulled into a truck stop to fuel up and grab food. While he was inside eating dinner, Richard saw a news report on the television mounted above the counter. The report mentioned that a psychiatric facility in Kansas City had reported a patient missing on Monday morning. A patient who'd been under observation but not technically incarcerated. The missing person was considered mentally unstable but not necessarily dangerous. Richard didn't think much about the report until he finished eating and returned to his truck. As he was preparing to continue driving, Richard heard a knock on his cab door. When he opened it, a woman was standing on the step, pressing her face close to his window. She had wild eyes and matted hair and wore a stained hospital gown. Richard jumped backward, shocked. "What the hell? Where did you come from?" The woman grabbed at the door handle. "Please, you have to let me out. I've been in there since yesterday. Please, I can't stay in there anymore. I have to get away." Richard realized with horror what had happened. The cargo he'd been hauling wasn't merchandise. It was a person. A human being had been sealed inside his trailer since Monday. The movement he'd felt, the sounds he'd heard, they'd been this woman trying to escape, trying to get someone's attention. Okay, Richard said, keeping his voice calm. "Come inside the cab, we'll figure this out." The woman climbed up and sat in the passenger seat. Up close, she was even more distressed than Richard had initially thought. She was disoriented, confused, speaking in fragmented sentences about being taken, being put in darkness, needing to escape. "What's your name?" Richard asked gently. "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. I was in a hospital, but they were going to do something to me, something bad. Someone came at night and took me, and I woke up in that dark place. I've been in there for so long screaming, but no one heard me. You have to help me." Richard called the police from his cell phone and explained the situation. Officers arrived within 40 minutes. When they opened the sealed trailer, they found it completely empty except for the cargo seal still intact. There was nothing inside, no sign that anyone had ever been there, but Sarah was sitting in Richard's cab, absolutely real, solid, distressed, but undeniably present. The police were confused. The trailer was sealed when they opened it, seal number matching perfectly. But there was a woman claiming to have been inside. How was that possible? Sarah was taken into custody for evaluation. She claimed she'd been in the trailer, had been trapped inside the dark container. But when the police checked the warehouse records in Kansas City, they found something disturbing. Sarah Mitchell had indeed been a patient at the psychiatric facility. She had gone missing on Monday morning, exactly when Richard had picked up his load. But there was a problem. The cargo had been sealed on Monday before Sarah went missing, and the documentation showed that no one had any knowledge of Sarah being placed in the trailer. According to the record, the sealed cargo had been prepared, documented, and delivered to the truck stop in a completely normal process. Richard was questioned extensively. Polygraph tests confirmed he was telling the truth about picking up a sealed trailer and hearing movement inside, but there was no explanation for how Sarah could have gotten into a sealed container or how she'd been in his cab now despite the seal never being broken. The police eventually determined that the incident was anomalous but not criminal. Richard was cleared of any wrongdoing. Sarah was admitted to a different psychiatric facility, though her account of being in the trailer was noted but not believed by most of the staff. Richard completed the delivery to Atlanta with an empty trailer. The cargo mysteriously absent, but the seal still intact. He never found out what happened to the sealed load or where its contents had gone. The brokerage had no explanation when he called to report the situation. For weeks afterward, Richard obsessed over the incident. He reviewed his memories of picking up the trailer, examined the photographs he'd taken of the seal, replayed conversations with the dispatcher. Everything was documented and logical. He'd picked up a sealed trailer with documented cargo. Later, a woman appeared in his cab claiming to have been in that sealed trailer. But the trailer was never unsealed, the seal never broken. Richard eventually concluded that he'd experienced something that violated the normal rules of space and containment. Sarah had somehow been inside the sealed trailer despite that being physically impossible. She'd existed in that space in a way that defied explanation. And somehow, at the truck stop in Memphis, she'd become corporeal enough to interact with the physical world, to open his cab door, to sit in his passenger seat, to be real enough for police to arrest and question. Richard never moved sealed cargo again after that incident. He specifically requested assignments where he could see the cargo, where he knew what was in the containers. But he understood that some phenomena existed on the highways that couldn't be explained or rationalized. They simply happened, violating expectations and challenging perception of how reality worked. Sarah eventually disappeared from the psychiatric system. She was either released or transferred to another facility. Richard never heard what became of her, never knew whether she considered her strange transportation a rescue or a torture. But he remembered her face, the desperation in her eyes, the way she desperately needed to escape from a sealed space that shouldn't have been able to contain anything at all. Story 8. The Miles That Multiplied. Patricia Santiago had been driving routes across the western United States for 21 years when she encountered the phenomenon of distance becoming negotiable. It happened in August of 2024 during a run from Seattle to San Francisco carrying perishable goods. The load was fresh seafood, time-sensitive and requiring temperature-controlled transport. Patricia had made this run at least 100 times over her career. The distance was approximately 800 miles, taking roughly 12 hours of driving time, accounting for fuel stops and rest breaks. Patricia left Seattle early morning with the refrigeration unit running at precisely 38 degrees. The route took her south through Oregon and into Northern California on Interstate 5, a straightforward drive that Patricia knew intimately. She'd driven this stretch so many times she could almost do it on autopilot. Weather was clear, traffic was light for early morning, and Patricia was on schedule for delivery by early evening in San Francisco. The first few hours were completely routine. Patricia passed through Portland, crossed into Oregon, maintained a steady speed. Around 1 p.m. near the Oregon-California border, Patricia noticed something odd on her odometer. According to her calculations, she should have covered approximately 500 miles since leaving Seattle. But her odometer showed only 200 miles. Patricia pulled over and calculated more carefully. She'd been driving for 6 hours, averaging what should have been about 83 miles per hour, accounting for one brief fuel stop. She should have covered approximately 500 miles. But the odometer clearly read just over 200 miles. Almost 300 miles were missing. Patricia checked her GPS. The device showed her location correctly on Interstate 5 near the California border. The map's scale seemed normal. But according to the GPS calculation, she'd only traveled 200 miles from Seattle, which would mean her speed had been significantly below what she'd maintained. Patricia decided to check her fuel consumption. She'd started with a full tank and had stopped once to refuel. She should have burned through fuel according to the distance traveled, but her fuel gauge indicated she'd used approximately the amount she'd expect if she'd only traveled 200 miles. Everything was consistent with her having traveled 200 miles, except her perception of the time and speed. Patricia calculated that she must have been driving at approximately 33 miles per hour, which was impossible. She clearly remembered driving at 65 to 70 miles per hour, watching the landscape move at normal highway speeds. Patricia called her dispatcher and reported the strange odometer reading. The dispatcher checked her GPS location, confirmed she was at the right place on the map, and advised her to continue to San Francisco. Maybe there was a calibration error in the odometer. She should monitor it and report any other discrepancies. Patricia continued driving, paying close attention to her instruments. The fuel consumption seemed normal for the distance according to the odometer. The GPS remained accurate in terms of location, but the time-distance ratio continued to be impossible. Patricia was covering distance at a rate that should have taken her weeks to reach San Francisco, not a single day. Around 3 p.m., Patricia crossed the California border and continued south. She stopped for lunch at a truck stop and checked her odometer reading again. According to her calculations, she'd now traveled about 300 miles total since leaving Seattle, despite having spent 9 hours on the road. That would mean an average speed of approximately 33 miles per hour, which remained impossible. Patricia walked into the truck stop and asked the attendant what time it was. The attendant confirmed it was 3 p.m. Pacific time on August 6th. Patricia verified the date on her phone. Yes, it was definitely August 6th. Patricia had been driving since early morning on August 6th, and it was now mid-afternoon of the same day. But according to the distance covered, Patricia should have been driving since August 2nd or August 3rd. She should have lost several days somewhere in her journey, but her watch, her phone, the calendar, all confirmed that only one day had passed. Patricia purchased a fresh cup of coffee and checked a physical map of the highway. According to the map, San Francisco should be about 500 miles south of her current location. But her odometer indicated she was only about 300 miles from Seattle, which would place her somewhere in Northern California, maybe near Redding, not near the Oregon border where her GPS said she was located. The map location and the odometer location were contradicting each other. Patricia was sitting in Northern California, according to the GPS, but her odometer suggested she hadn't left Oregon yet. Patricia continued driving. Around 5 p.m., as the afternoon was turning to evening, she noticed traffic beginning to pick up as she approached larger cities. She passed signs for Redding, then continued south. According to her GPS, she was making normal progress toward San Francisco, but her odometer continued to record impossible distances, suggesting she was barely moving at all. Around 7 p.m., Patricia saw the exit for San Francisco and took the turn toward the city. She drove for what felt like about 30 minutes, according to her watch, covering what should have been about 30 miles. But her odometer registered only about 3 miles of travel. The GPS guided her into the warehouse district where her delivery was scheduled. Patricia pulled up to the designated loading dock right on time, according to her watch, 7:45 p.m., matching her estimated arrival. She'd been driving for approximately 11 hours, which was right on schedule for the journey from Seattle to San Francisco. But her odometer told a completely different story. According to the instrument, she'd only traveled approximately 305 miles since leaving Seattle, not the 800 miles the route should have required. The warehouse manager came out to meet Patricia and check in with the driver. When Patricia mentioned the odometer issue, the manager looked confused. "Are you saying your truck only showed 300 miles for a Seattle to San Francisco haul? That's what the odometer reads, but the GPS shows I'm at the right location and my watch shows the right time. I don't understand what's happening." The warehouse manager walked back into the office and returned with a computer printout. "Our security system tracked you coming off the highway at the California border approximately 4 hours ago. That's when we started monitoring your vehicle. According to our data, you've been driving in circles around the San Francisco area for 4 hours, not heading directly to this location." Patricia felt her stomach drop. "I was heading directly here. GPS guided me right to this location." "Maybe," the manager said, "or maybe something caused you to loop around. But I'm telling you, our cameras show you've been in the area for 4 hours. Patricia's hands were shaking. She'd lost 4 hours. Her watch said it was 7:45 p.m. same day. But according to the warehouse manager's security system, Patricia had arrived at the California border around 3 p.m. or 4 p.m. and had been in the San Francisco area ever since. Patricia looked at her odometer again. The reading was now approximately 312 miles. It had barely moved in the 4 hours she'd apparently been in the San Francisco area. She'd driven from Seattle across 400 miles of Oregon and Northern California, reaching the San Francisco area where she circled around for 4 hours, yet the odometer showed only 300 miles of travel. The math didn't work. The distances didn't match. Patricia had experienced a phenomenon where time and distance had become disconnected, where she'd covered territory without moving the odometer proportionally, where 800 miles had somehow compressed into 300 miles of recorded distance. Patricia unloaded the cargo, which had maintained perfect temperature throughout the journey according to the refrigeration unit's data log. She'd traveled for an entire day and maintained the cold chain perfectly. But according to her odometer, she'd only traveled about 300 miles, and according to the warehouse security, she'd been missing for 4 hours while circling in the San Francisco area. Patricia made her way back to her home in Los Angeles over the next few days, taking her time, running local deliveries while she tried to understand what had happened. She consulted mechanics about the odometer. They ran diagnostics and found no fault. The odometer was functioning perfectly. It had accurately recorded 300 miles of distance traveled. The GPS had accurately recorded her location. Her watch had accurately recorded the passage of time. But the 3 data points contradicted each other in ways that shouldn't be possible. Patricia had traveled 800 miles according to geography. She'd driven for 12 hours according to time. But her vehicle had recorded only 300 miles. The other 500 miles had simply disappeared, compressed, made impossible. Patricia never figured out what happened that day. She continued driving for several more years after the incident, but she always experienced a strange sense that certain routes compressed distance in ways that couldn't be measured by normal instruments. She would arrive places faster or slower than the distance and time suggested they should arrive. She eventually retired from long-haul trucking, convinced that the highways themselves contained anomalies, that distance and time were less stable than anyone believed. Patricia knew what she'd experienced. She'd driven 800 miles while her odometer recorded 300. She'd covered territory that simply wasn't visible on her instruments. And she'd discovered that the relationship between distance, time, and space was far more negotiable than conventional physics suggested. The mystery of those missing 500 miles stayed with Patricia for the rest of her life. She never got an explanation, never found another driver who'd experienced exactly the same phenomenon. But she knew it was real. She knew that somewhere on Interstate 5 between Seattle and San Francisco, the normal rules of measurement had bent, stretched, and become impossible in ways that no one could explain or rationalize away.